So welcome to the second Dream Collective webinar in our series on dismantling institutionalized racism and white supremacy in the academy. My name is JT Snipes, and I'm a member of the Dream Collective and an assistant professor at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville. Today's webinar is titled Still Searching for Justice, Free Speech, and Anti-Blackness in U.S. Higher Education. You will notice a toolbar at the bottom of your screen that you can use to access the chat and Q&A function. Please add questions you're thinking about as we go on. The chat as well as the Q&A are being moderated by scholar and fellow collective member Jen Hernandez. When we get near to the end of the session, we'll open up the floor for your questions to hear from you directly. In the interim, please feel free to introduce yourself, your name, organization, and what brings you to the webinar today. A little bit about the Dream Collective. We are an organization that is committed to serving Southern Illinois and the greater St. Louis area through supporting community members, educational organizations, and professionals in the process of naming, addressing, and dismantling racism through education, advocacy, and mobilization. In today's webinar, I am very excited to have my brilliant friend and colleague, Dr. LaWanda Ward, joining us. Dr. LaWanda Ward is an assistant professor of education and research associate in the Center for the Study of Higher Education at Pennsylvania State University. Her commitment to social justice, equity, and inclusion in higher education is influenced by her family of educators. Her research agenda centers on critically analyzing legal issues in higher education, including race-conscious admissions, free speech, and academic freedom. For over 20 years prior to joining the professoriate, Dr. Ward has served as a student affairs educator in various roles. She earned a PhD in higher education and student affairs with an interdisciplinary minor in socio-legal perspectives on race and gender in higher education from Indiana University, a JD from the McKinney School of Law, an MS in Educational Administration from Old Dominion, an MA in Political Science from Illinois State University, and a BA in Political Science from Murray State University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. LaWanda Ward. It is great to be with you and to be discussing your work today.
I am happy and excited to be here. Thank you. Special thanks to Dr. Robin Hughes, the Dean of the School of Education, a former professor of mine at IU. So I want to give her a shout out and thank you all for this opportunity for the conversation.
Great. So I'm going to start our panel off with more of a personal question. How are you holding up during this time of unrest?
I'm maintaining, JT. You and I, we were on a panel earlier this week, and we all got a chance as Black scholars to kind of talk about what it's like in this moment for us. COVID-19, which disproportionately impacts Black people, Indigenous people, and other racially and ethnically minoritized people disproportionately, the cases are increasing, all over the country. So while in some ways, I guess maybe there's this myth that we're post-COVID, we definitely are not. There's also what I consider to be this short-term heightened attention around police massacres of Black, trans, and cis women and men. I feel that I'm very blessed to have family and friends who I'm in community with, who I can talk with, cry with, laugh with, to help me persist in this moment and really all moments, but definitely in this one.
Yeah, it is so good to have family and friends, and to be able to get your mind off of all of the heaviness it seems like there's been an incident reported. To me, it feels like daily of another Black man or Black woman or Black trans person dying at the hands of our state. So it is good to have community to enshroud you during those times. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to do the work you do of addressing and resisting white supremacy and anti-Blackness?
So I identify as a cisgender heterosexual Black woman. I was born and raised in a small Western Tennessee town. I grew up in a multi-generational home. So I lived with my mom, my brother, and my maternal grandparents. You know, as it relates to my educational experiences, they've all been in white dominated spaces. My journey to becoming a full-time professor was not planned, but it's a journey that I don't regret because it has afforded me the opportunity to learn and unlearn about the complexities of US society. As you read off in my bio, you know, I have several degrees, but I'm really thinking more about this notion of liberatory learning. And when I say that, I mean, you know, really grappling with what does it mean for me to say that I'm going to do work that's going to contribute to racial equity and social justice. So thinking about liberatory learning, I feel like I'm fairly recent in that endeavor. And what I'm doing is I'm engaging work, mainly work by Black women thinkers who are inside and outside of the academy, looking to the ways in which, you know, they've already written about all, you know, pretty much all of the issues that we face, and not just reading their work, but really taking their work to heart in terms of, you know, what does it mean to continue attempting to do this work? So the way in which I come to the work is, you know, thinking about my experiences. I've pretty much been a student or in higher education in some capacity for several years. And so, and those types of institutions have been predominantly white serving. And, you know, I've learned that law has been more of an oppressor longer than it's been a liberator. And so when I embrace the scholarship and think about the scholarship that helps me to come to that conclusion, I attempt to create scholarship that's going to come to the conversation defining and redefining and addressing legal issues in US higher education.
So that's a great segue. As a layperson, my understanding of the law and free speech rights are very limited. So I'm wondering if you could help us understand what free speech is, and then connect us a little bit to your work about how these free speech laws are connected to and sometimes uphold anti-Black sentiment.
Sure. So, you know, I said, what's the quickest way to define free speech without, you know, necessarily citing people that people haven't read, and thinking about, you know, it's kind of funny. I always think about my students when they take my legal issues class. They're like, I don't know anything about law. And I'm always like, wonderful, great. I'm so happy that you don't. So, you know, if you look on Black's Law Dictionary and you're like, okay, what's free speech? It's going to have a definition that free speech is free expression that is guaranteed to us in US society by the First and the 14th Amendments. And those two amendments basically give us the right to speak without any restrictions from the government. And institutions of higher education are representations of the government. So before I talk about, I don't like to just use terms and assume that people know the definitions. And you know, in this climate, everybody's saying white supremacy, everybody's saying anti-Blackness. The ways in which I think about white supremacy is the ways in which Bell Hooks has defined it, which is an ideology in which white people, regardless of whether they identify as liberals or conservatives, it's a way that they perceive and relate to Black people, indigenous people, racially minoritized people. And for my comments, I'm mainly going to be talking about the Black experience. That white people are socialized to ignore that they have a race lived experience. You know, they're affirmed in, you know, believing that we're just people. There's no race to us. Race is something for other people. When I talk about anti-Blackness, I'm going to be using Dr. Kiana Ross's definition, which is society's inability to recognize our humanity. Anti-Blackness is disdain, disregard, and disgust for our existence. So in my thoughts around the relationship between the First Amendment, specifically free speech, and anti-Blackness, is law and anti-Blackness have an inseparable relationship, especially as it relates to Black people's access to First and 14th Amendment rights. And we've been deprived of those rights. You know, when the First Amendment became a part of the US Constitution in 1789, Black people were treated as chattel slavery. And then when the 14th Amendment, which pretty much guarantees us that the state can't interfere with our rights, it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, almost 100 years later, before there was any sort of interpretation of the 14th Amendment that treated us or, recognized us in a humane way. So for centuries, white people they've owned free speech. They've been able to define it, determine what it is. And in doing that, they've also created an arsenal of anti-Blackness that's institutionalized. And it's dehumanizing, it's demoralizing words, symbols, and behaviors. So for us today, you know, we're peddled this way of thinking about speech as something that, you know, is long-standing for all of us, but that's historically and contemporarily not accurate.
So I love a couple of things that you shared. Anti-Blackness as society's inability to recognize in terms of Black people, our humanity is a powerful way of framing it, and very appreciative. I'm gonna cite and use that.
Well, that's and cite Dr. Ross at Northwestern. Yes, cite her.
Yes, undoubtedly. And I'm very interested in this historical relationship of law to anti-Blackness. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering how you would respond, though, because in my conversation, it's pretty common to hear people say, well, I get that there's a history of injustice, but there has been the signage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? So technically, by the law, we're equal. So doesn't that mean we no longer have to grapple with these notions of anti-Blackness? Aren't we all equal now?
You know, if I were engaging in a conversation like that with someone, you know, I would probably pose more questions. You know, as academics, that was what we would do. But I would say, you know, sociologists and others have provided us with data that disproportionately in all facets of society, Black people, we're still not equal in terms of, you know, this notion of having the freedom to, you know, work without being harassed, you know, even being put in a position to get a job. And so it's like, wow, I think it's the US, we're very in love with being color, you know, race avoidance. Like race doesn't matter anymore. Look, you have all these laws. Look, Barack Obama was president. You know, we get all of these examples in an individual context to show us that race doesn't matter anymore. But when we think about systems and structures and still how things get interpreted, especially the law, our personhood, it hasn't been normalized. That would be my response. And I would really ask that person to think in terms of systems and structures around how they're making meaning about what the status is of Black people's treatment in the US.
I'm appreciative of that answer. And I'm thinking too here recently at SIUE, on our Facebook page, there was an incident where an employee was called a racial or racist epithet. And some institutions will take a stance, especially with SIUE being a public institution, that people have a constitutional right to free speech, and it is the institution's job not to infringe on those free speech rights. So I'm wondering, put on your general counsel hat, how should university administrators and general counsels approach this question of free speech, specifically as it relates to racism and anti-Blackness?
Okay, so in full disclosure, if you're asking me to put on a general counsel, it's likely going to have a different interpretation than those who are in those jobs. So let me just say that and put that out there for the audience, but I will weigh in on your question. But first, I think it's important to know what hate speech is. So the United States Supreme Court has established categories of speech. And one of those is hate speech, which is pretty much what we're going to be talking about. And hate speech is this ill-defined concept that's communicated through verbal, written, symbolic acts. And we typically identify them as that's racist, that's sexist, that's bigoted, that's homophobic. And hate speech is interpreted as free speech unless there's some caveats. Usually if it targets an identifiable person, if it creates a pervasive hostile environment, if it causes a substantial disruption to the learning environment, if it's believed that it could be a true threat or physical violence could happen. And there could be some other factors that institutions consider, just depending on, like, you know, what their process is for thinking about hate speech. In my thoughts, hate speech interpretations typically dismiss or ignore Black pain. And there's typically these demands that there has to be a whiteness-informed legal logic that's the criteria that's used for that has to be met. So like in this example that you gave, I would say, you know, it sounds like it's anti-Blackness hate speech. If there is a racial epithet that was used, especially one that's historically been connected with dehumanizing Black people, it was likely acknowledged as that. Oh, that's hate speech. And it sounds like it might have been directed toward an employee, that might be acknowledged. But where the part comes, and that's usually, I would say, hurtful and disappointing for Black people, is when the instance wasn't perceived as creating a hostile work environment, or it wasn't perceived as a true threat or physical violence. And so in this ways, you know, Black pain, it has to be legible to whiteness. And we know that we've always had a difficulty in saying, you know, just because I don't have bruises, I have still been harmed by what was said. I have still been wounded, assaulted. So it doesn't surprise me in that instance that there was an interpretation of, yes, that's hate speech. It was said to that person, but it doesn't rise to the level to meet the rest of the criteria that we might consider.
So what would you encourage? Well, is there, I guess I should ask, is there a way, because you phrased it so beautifully, is there a way for us to make our Black pain legible to whiteness? And is that even something that we should be attempting to do?
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, again, there is no shortage of studies, data collected over time, really since Black people started attending historically white institutions. There's no shortage of our experiences, you know, how we've been treated, what's been said to us, what's been done to us. So I don't think that should be the focus. What I would like to see more so is university administrators, general counsels really approaching free speech with a commitment to developing legal interpretations of hate speech that align with the racial equity commitments that institutions have. And so centering a legal logic that no longer institutionalizes anti-Blackness. And then ideally, that would be recognition of Black pain. So I think of two examples, and I'm not, saying that this was the motivation of these leaders, but I think it's that these are two examples that addressed anti-Blackness in a higher education setting. So one, people might remember in January of 2018, the University of Alabama's president, Dr. Stuart Bell, he expelled a white woman who was in a sorority. She had posted on Instagram a video using the N-word repeatedly and expressing her hatred for Black people. So Dr. Bell released a statement saying, this person's speech is not in alignment with the University of Alabama's institutional mission and values. I made a decision, she's no longer in the community. Now, as people would imagine, he was criticized by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, the American Civil Liberties Union, like several organizations, and they even said to her, we'll represent you because what happened to you was a violation of your free speech rights. Now, the second example just happened earlier this week with, at Purdue University, there was a statement released on Monday where President Mitch Daniels, he expelled an undergraduate second-year white man who had made some posts to social media, one where the N-word was used to refer to Black people, and then there was another with a TikTok video where the man was pretending to run over Black Lives Matters protesters. Now, President Daniels has a law degree from Georgetown Law School, so he has legal knowledge. But I'm also sure that General Counsel for Purdue likely strongly advised him, this is not the decision to make in expelling the student. This is hate speech, but it still warrants First Amendment protection because there aren't any, these messages weren't targeted toward a specific Black person. There's no pervasive hostile environment. There's no evidence of a true threat. But President Daniels made that decision. So for me, I'd really like to see presidents of institutions taking a stand to say, anti-Blackness hate speech has no place in our campus community.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's interesting because some of the things that I've been seeing over the past couple of years is colleges taking a stand, particularly around these notions of disinvitation. So I think about Milo Yiannopoulos and other, Ben Shapiro, other conservatives that have been touring around the nation, sort of riling up students against what I would argue is more humane and compassionate ways of approaching thinking, right? So these speakers, for a lot of institutions, have been found to not align with institutional values and therefore have been disinvited. But the response from conservatives have been actually to not disinvite, to not censor speech, but actually to, as Justice Brandeis would say, the remedy being applied to hateful speech is more speech, not the enforced silence. So where do you sit on this? How should folks in colleges respond to these sorts of calls for on both sides, right? So there is a liberal space of folks saying, we don't want these speakers on our campus. And then there's a conservative voice that's saying, we need greater speech. What do you think about that?
Okay, so I have some comments, but I also have some questions too that I want people to grapple with. So, my response, so for starters, there's no shortage of Supreme Court sound bites that reinforce this notion of, we need broader free speech.
LaWanda, you're muted.
Okay. What was the last thing you heard me say? I don't know what happened.
No shortage of broader free speech that's out there.
Okay, thank you. So I would respond and say, in a society where law hasn't been used to normalize anti-Blackness and establish Black subjugation as moral social order for centuries, and in contemporary times, Black personhood matters, I would say yes. Justice Brandeis's quote would be sensical. But law hasn't been used to rationalize, it has been used to rationalize Black enslavement, Black massacres, Black exclusion, and Black pain. And so this notion of when conservative speakers come to campus and they're going to deliver what's called a controversial talk, we get the boilerplate messages. X community deplores racist, sexist, transphobic, fill in the blank. We are an inclusive campus. We value everyone. But because of the First Amendment, there's nothing we can do. So you should feel free to have a forum to talk about this perceived dehumanizing event taking place and to seek counseling. So I want to pose some questions for people to grapple with around this, because I think there's complexity to it. So why are Black people asked to have a conversation about anti-Blackness hate speech, how it continues to contribute to toxic campus climates? Where is the promotion for white people to talk about how whiteness-informed legal logic is used to interpret dehumanizing speech as free speech? It's not the First Amendment that precludes institutions from acting, it's the interpretation of the First Amendment. And I think we have to always demand and remind people to be precise in that description. And then why are Black people recommended to seek counseling about anti-Blackness occurrences when it's possible and probable that we're already doing that as we try to process imposter syndrome, tokenism, and racist-induced exhaustion? But JT, we're told that the First Amendment is a friend to Black people. And that's the reason why Black people could march in the 1960s. But that's not accurate. Black people were jailed for protesting anti-Blackness. But we're peddled this whiteness-informed legal logic that we have to tolerate anti-Blackness hate speech that dehumanizes us so that supposedly we can use speech to advocate to eradicate white supremacy and any other system of oppression. So if we follow that line of logic, that means arguments about anti-Blackness and white supremacy are arguable. And it's all about intellectual difference, as opposed to, we're talking about deprivation of equal personhood. So in my opinion, the current conversations as it relates to what institutions of higher education say they want to represent and do, the conversations around hate speech and lots of other laws, they're just not in alignment with equity and inclusion and any other buzzword that's being used. It just doesn't line up.
No, that is right on. I want to pivot slightly and get us thinking more concretely about the tools that we can offer folks. There's a range of faculty and administrators on this call today, and I'm wondering what tools are available to those administrators to help them navigate the free speech minefield on campus. I'm thinking particularly about resources from organizations like the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE. You mentioned earlier some other organizations. I wonder if you could share about those tools.
So let me say, if people are looking for, intellectual exchanges or perspectives on free speech, interpretations of hate speech, then, definitely FIRE has information about its position. Critical race scholars, they wrote 25 years ago about this. More recently, myself and some other scholars, we wrote an article that's featured actually in a special issue for Change, the magazine for higher education. And so all of the articles in there are short and easy for people to read. So if practitioners are like, hey, LaWanda, I don't have the time or interest to do, a lot of scholarly reading, I recommend that. I also recommend Tanisha Tevis, a Black woman scholar. She wrote a 2020 article about white men presidential presidents and their responses to racism. There's another great piece on anti-Blackness in higher education by Dancy, Edwards, and Davis.
Yeah.
It's like when I think about who's writing about free speech and talking about what to do, there's this, what I would consider a restriction. Like people are saying, here's the law and what it is, and you can only do these things. But my hope is that people are interested in asking questions and making demands about broader, more humanity affirming interpretations around free speech.
Are there any other examples you can think of? You mentioned Mitch Daniels earlier pushing for a more progressive interpretation and being willing to subjugate the institution to legal liability. Are there other notable examples of campuses who are trying to push this thing forward?
So I mentioned President Daniels and I mentioned President Bell at the University of Alabama. I'm not aware of other institutional leaders who have made those moves. There's several institutions, especially when some of the conservative, controversial speakers were on the circuit, there were institutions that, blatantly said, we're disinviting you, or you can't come here. And, there were lawsuits that were filed. I think there was one filed against the University of Georgia, maybe. But, several institutions have said, and it's not under the guise of, your speech is anti-Black or deplorable. It's more so we're concerned about safety. And that's a legitimate reason, but I still would like to see more of a connection to the realities that our racial ills have not been solved. They have not been solved.
So I appreciate you sharing. I do want to ask you to do a little bit of personal reflection as a faculty member in the academy that is very well educated. Degrees on degrees on degrees, right? I'd love to hear a little bit about your experiences as a faculty member, particularly as it relates to anti-Blackness.
Yeah, so, again, I'm a Black woman who, teaches and have taught mainly white students. And I'm inviting them to critique law. And I'm inviting them to critique it in a way where I say, these are whiteness-informed logics that are used to define legal issues and give rationales around law's role and reasonings. And, as people would imagine who do work in the vein of racial equity and social justice, resistance is a part of the terrain. And the resistance can be in the forms of aggression, silence, subject changing, rejection. But I can say I am encouraged because I do have students across racial and ethnic identities who they want to learn more. Excuse me. They're very interested in probing and critiquing. Because, sometimes we're like, oh, I'm not a lawyer, so that doesn't make sense. I don't understand it. But I say, and this is a tidbit for everyone, You don't have to have formal legal training. If you understand how white supremacy operates, you understand law. So do more questioning, ask questions. When people tell you, well, the law says this, and especially if they attempt to tell you, well, the First Amendment says this, push back and say, well, that's one interpretation. And in my opinion, it doesn't align with where the institution is moving and what we're doing.
Yes. On a similar note, I'm on Facebook, and I have, especially shortly after the death of George Floyd, I think there was a desire, particularly for my white friends and colleagues, to want to be able to do something, right? And I'm wondering, what can our white colleagues do around the country to disrupt anti-Blackness on campus? And what can Black folks, well, I'll just let you start with that question.
Okay. You know, for white people, work to unlearn anti-Blackness behaviors and learning and language. You know, it's a lifelong endeavor for white people who are committed or want to be committed to developing a white identity that advances racial equity. So, you know, definitely do reading, but then do action. And if you're in a position of power on in a campus community, use your voice to question and call out these whiteness-informed legal logics that interpret laws in ways that promote anti-Blackness, and specifically the ways in which hate speech gets peddled to Blacks and others as free speech. Like, we really have to ask ourselves, is that the kind of commitment that we want to make to that type of interpretation? You know, I would also say to people, and this is just in general, ask questions of your institutional leaders, especially, and you had mentioned it, you know, people say, well, we don't want to be sued, or we don't want outside legal organizations calling us out. But again, my response to that, institutions of higher education are in the best position to determine how to create humanity affirming environments. And part of that is saying, this is what is acceptable. We welcome dissent, but we don't welcome dehumanization. And there's a difference. There's a difference. Asking me to engage in an intellectual conversation around my humanity, how do I do that, JT? How do I prove to someone that I deserve recognition as a human being of equal personhood? That shouldn't be a burden that we have to bear.
That's such a powerful point. And in thinking about the burden that we have to bear as Black folks, sometimes it can feel like the work for us is just to continue being Black. So I'm wondering, in addition to just surviving, right? Like, what can Black folks do, as well as other folks of color who are dealing with anti-racist environments? What is our work dismantling anti-Blackness?
You know, I think a big part of our work is unlearning the normalcy of doing that. You know, thinking about Bell Hooks's definition of white supremacy, and especially the ways in which she emphasizes Black people, other racially minoritized people, we can reinforce anti-Blackness. We can use these logics around, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You know, you're just not making it because you're not working hard enough, or that didn't happen to you, or it wasn't you're thinking that happened as a racial issue, but it really wasn't. Like, to me, we have to stop and ask ourselves, why am I making this assessment of not believing someone who's telling me that they have had a racialized experience, especially as a Black person? Why am I showing up asking questions in ways that demonstrate anti-Blackness? Why am I doing that? I think we have to do self-reflection. And for those of us who feel like we know enough and we can do more, then we have to help others come along with that. When we're in these conversations with family, friends, colleagues, whomever, and anti-Blackness rhetoric shows itself, we should call it out. We should ask questions. We should probe, you know, but at the same time, I'm not saying that that's the role for all Black people to do, because a lot of Black people are tired, and rightfully so. And it's like we have to ask ourselves, how do we get to 2020 and we're still trying to convince people that we have equal personhood, especially we have all the laws, we had a Black president, like all of these reasons that are given to us for us to feed into this notion that we're post-racial.
So I'm glad you mentioned us being tired, right? Because I feel that too. There's an energy, strangely, that I feel with public sentiment being more open to thinking about racial injustice. You know, I was surprised several years ago when the senator, I don't know why I can't think of his name right now. Anyway, that there is, when you have Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul, you know, acknowledging that injustice has occurred, I think you can feel somewhat of a shift in the racial climate. So there's hope there, but we still got a long way to go, because Mitch McConnell also said that that we should be happy we got Barack Obama, right? Like that was a token and a signpost for racial progress and us being post-racial. But I am interested in how you manage this tiredness, how you personally cope with having to consistently fight anti-Blackness on campus and in our community.
So, you know, honestly, JT, I had to come to terms with the reality of things, which is, as a Black woman, currently and previously at historically white serving institutions, they're not made for me to be there. They weren't constructed for me to be a knowledge producer, to be someone who's contributing to the betterment of society. I wasn't in any of those evaluations, the building of this nation, any of that, as someone who could legitimately make a contribution. So, you know, I'm very realistic about, you know, my voice possibly not being deemed as worthy of consideration. But I'm also encouraged, like you, it's like, I don't know if mine is so much around the energy of the moment. In some ways it is, but, you know, honestly, it's engaging the work of Black women thought leaders inside and outside of the academy who've been doing this work for centuries. So I tell myself, I'm like, you know, I actually have a lot of tools that Black women before me didn't have. And look how powerful their work is. Look how it's influencing me and others on this journey of a liberatory learning. So it's just like, I'm encouraged in those ways. I'm realistic. I keep my expectations calibrated because, again, I know that, especially since I'm not teaching or promoting law in the quote unquote traditional way, there's going to be resistance for me, and I have to prepare myself for that, and I have to understand that. Now, thankfully for me, I have a great intellectual community that's around me. You're a part of it, and, you know, lots of other people. And so I am constantly being validated in ways and encouraged to keep doing the work.
So this will be my last question before we jump into the Q&A. There have been a ton of questions, so thank you all for submitting them. But again, we're going to try our best to get through all of them. I can't make guarantees, but I'm sure Dr. Ward would be glad for you to reach out post this discussion. But my last question for you, before we jump into the Q&A, is an imaginative question, and I want you to share with me, if it's possible, can you even imagine a campus free from anti-Black racism? What would that campus look like to you? What would it sound like? I'm just interested in imagining wild futures, right? Like, because if we can't imagine it, you know, what are we doing this work for?
Okay. So, let me say this. I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, and I'm okay with that. What motivates me to do my work, and especially here recently, and I might get a little emotional talking about it, is that I have a great niece now, who's 1 year old. Well, another great niece, I should say. The youngest one is 1 year old. And when I think about if she chooses to go to college, what would I want her experience to be? How would I want her to describe it to me? So I think of two things. I would love to see presidents outright reject anti-Blackness, hate speech, especially in their campus communities. Like, they take the lead from Purdue and the University of Alabama to really say, you know, here's the type of intellectual community that we are building. Here's what we want our legacy to be, what our contribution to a democratic society to be. So I'd love to see more of what those two presidents did happen. The second is I'd love to see general counsels and their attorney staffs providing advocacy that eradicates anti-Blackness speech and other oppressive systems, that they would, you know, say, you know what, a whiteness-informed legal logic, it's not helping us with our racial equity and inclusion commitments. I'd love to see those individuals be passionate in developing legal strategies that align with institutional commitments. You know, I was in law school many moons ago, but I do remember, you know, this notion of being a zealous advocate for your client. And so, you know, for general counsel and staff and really anyone else who's in a role of doing legal interpretation, it's like, what's your zealous advocacy for racial equity, for an a humanity affirming campus community? Like, what does that look like? So yeah, that's my moment of imagination and hope in some ways.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I'm going to jump into the Q&A, and we have some fun questions. So I want to start with a fun question that I'm actually interested in. So I don't know who asked this question, but they asked, is there legal standing for a Black person to engage in a physical confrontation after being called a racial epithet?
Is there, so
can you put hands on somebody if they call you out your name?
You know, if that happens, you're going to be arrested. You're going to be arrested because, you know, the expectation is that, you know, you walk away to diffuse the situation, or you engage in a conversation with this person in some sort of way, like you attempt to diffuse it. But if there is any sort of physical contact that takes place, you're likely going to be arrested. Now, if you're on campus, well, that could be your reality too. It's possible that maybe if the campus police came, things could look different. But if there's a physical altercation, people are going to be arrested. Yeah. So, and I won't even say try to avoid, because what does that look like? Right. Like, you know, for Black people, we're at the mercy of white rage and violence. And so, you know, attempting to tell us to, you know, to diffuse the situation or do something different, that isn't always realistic.
Thank you. So another questioner asked, in K-12 education, there are historic examples in which public schools' legal right to restrict speech in order to protect their core mission, student learning, has been recognized. Would or does that same legal framework apply in higher ed? And has it been used to enact consequences for or to not allow speakers who make students feel unsafe?
So I like that question. I don't study the K-12 cases closely, but what I do know has been brought over into higher education, and I spoke to it because it was used in a situation that I was involved in. So the Tinker case, I can't think of what year it is. It's Mary Beth Tinker and her brother. They wore the black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. And this is where, another one of these sound bites, I forget which justice said, students and teachers, they don't leave their free speech rights at the gates of the school. And in that particular Supreme Court case, the court looked at whether something was a substantial disruption to the educational environment. So that has been brought over into higher education to be used, but I would say not in an effective way. But it's shown up, and I've been involved in a situation where it was shown up and used as a way to actually say, well, what you're talking about doesn't rise to the level of being a substantial disruption. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, first of all, your interpretation, again, Black pain is not resonating. It's not showing up in ways where it's being validated. So, yeah.
So this is a really interesting question, and I like it too. How might we use labor law and our union to push for hiring and retaining Black faculty members?
How might we
use labor law and our union to push for hiring and retaining Black faculty members?
So, the interesting thing about it, again, I will cautiously say this. I think we have enough laws. We have all the laws that we need. It's the interpretation. It's the interpretation of them. And so in thinking about hiring Black faculty, nowadays, most institutions will say, yes, we want to hire a diverse faculty because we want our faculty to reflect our student population. We want diverse voices. So I don't think that's the issue. It's the retention. It's the experience. It's when I experience a workplace environment that isn't welcoming to me. And when I report it to someone, they don't think that it rises to the level of something to be addressed. Those are the types of problems that really concern me. And I'll use an example. So right now I'm doing some research around, which, if people are following, there are 3 Black faculty that were denied tenure. And so there's a lot of conversation around the process that happened with them being denied. And so I've been looking at the lawsuits of Black faculty who have been denied tenure. And it is so difficult to read their interviews about what happened to them. The things that were said or not said. Like, they didn't have access to the real way to do things. And that ended up, having a negative impact on them. So for me, we have laws that are helpful to us. It's how are they getting interpreted and who's in a position, like what is their mindset in making those interpretations?
Yes. I'm gonna try to get through a couple more of these questions. Someone asked, Dr. Ward, can you speak more to the role that students, both graduate and undergraduate, have in creating change? I've noticed that oftentimes, quote, conservative folks are allowed to come on public universities, and oftentimes students are on the front line. Universities are often responding to protests instead of taking more direct action. Curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think students across status, undergrad, graduate, professional, I think they're really powerful members of the community. Because as with anything, I don't have a job if there are no students to teach. You don't either. Institutions, we don't run unless we have people who are interested in coming and being learners and co-producers of knowledge. So I would say any student who recognizes that their campus climate isn't living up to the espoused expectations or what they observe, then talk with people about it. Talk with administrators, talk with the leadership, you know, for your college. I don't know how quickly you would get a meeting with the president, but, you know, maybe rally some of your peers together to say, you know what, we're gonna come together, we're gonna write a letter, we're gonna be very explicit about, you know, what we observe, what we see. We wanna have a meeting with leadership, and here are the things that we want to see happen. You know, students, there's a history of students always pushing for the change that they wanted to see. So definitely students are some of the most powerful members of our community.
Yes, I always refer my students to Joyanne Williamson's work on the Black Power movement right here in the state of Illinois from 1965 to 1970, right? There was a moment in which students were literally transforming the landscape of higher education. And out of those protests, you have the creation of these Black Studies programs at predominantly white institutions. So they're definitely powerful. So I could probably get 2 more questions in before our hour is up.
Okay.
The first question is around tracking. This person writes, I spent 30 years in academia at a university that struggles with diversity. And I worry that without specific cumulative tracking of individual instances of anti-Blackness, alongside the repercussions, things will never change. My belief is that without this tracking, academic administrators and leaders are not able to see / admit that there is a pervasive problem. Because if they did, this would make them liable to change it. What are your thoughts on these limited observations? Would better documented specific tracking help?
You know, and I can only speak to my limited knowledge of things in some ways. And I'm going to use Penn State as an example. I'm fairly new here, but when I came, you know, informally people were sharing with me that Black faculty don't stay. And since I've been here, there has been a report, and my understanding is that it's one of many reports that has been put together by Black faculty, laying out for Penn State, you know, here are the issues, here are what happened, here are the things that happen that have an effect on Black faculty and why they leave. And here are recommendations of things that we think that can be done for retention. So in knowing that there's already been, and this isn't for all institutions, but for many, there's already been the tracking and the evidence producing, saying here's the data that shows at our institution what's happening. So then the question needs to be to the institutional leaders, tell us why you're not acting. Now, I would think that they would have responses, and then people have to decide based on the responses provided if they are ones that they think have merit. And if they don't, then say, you know, well, you're giving this response. This is the response that we've heard many times over. This isn't meeting our expectations. Here are the things that we want to see. And again, that goes back to the power of students. You know, the collective power of saying to institutional leaders, this is what I need to have the type of educational experience that I came here for.
So the last question, and thank you all for submitting your questions. Again, Dr. Ward will be available to answer them, I'm sure, if you reach out. So
okay, JT, don't have like 200 emails. No,
I'm sure you got plenty of free time to answer that.
Of course, I'm just on the tenure track, right? What else could I possibly be doing?
Nothing too important, right? Totally kidding. This last question, though, is I think an important one.
It's all good.
And the question asker is wondering if you could speak to how institutions are protecting statues, particularly of hate. So when you think about what's happening at Texas A&M, there's been a push to remove the statue of Sol Ross, who's the slave owner, and the university is protecting the statue with cameras, sending police officers, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that situation where this statue is a clear symbol. It's hate speech in a symbolic form, right? So I'm wondering what you think of those situations, and what should administration and folks do to remove those symbols of hate on their campus?
So, for a while, again, ebbing and flowing the demands of, I won't just say students, but people across campus communities saying, we have known buildings named by statues of, but again, part of that reality that I tell myself about is, higher education is a capitalistic system. And in some instances, those statues are connected to people who donated them, who have wealth, or people with wealth want those statues to stay. And again, it becomes this institutional reflection of, okay, we have students demanding and asking us to do this. What's going to be our legacy? Are we going to continue to say, we can't take it down? The donors said they won't donate, they'll stop providing us funds, and that impacts how we can fund all of you. I think because there's a commitment, and this is across the country, to still give homage to whiteness, and even whiteness that is a display of dehumanization that people, if they were still around, you and I would not be on campus. There's still this nostalgic connection. And unfortunately, to me, the institutions that are looking for every reason under the sun not to make changes, they need to be called on that and demanded to, pretty much say, tell us how you justify dehumanizing symbols on this campus to us when we have, one, asked you to remove them, and then two, connected to this mission and vision of racial equity inclusion. Help us call people out. And as you mentioned earlier, this seems to be the moment. Everybody wants to be Ibrahim Kendi's anti-racist, and so people are reading and they're doing things. So I think this is a moment to keep pressing about symbols on campus that people know are connected to individuals who dehumanization is their default for thinking about people like me and you and others.
Well, I know you have to run, so I just want to say thank you for spending this hour with me. Where can folks go to learn more about you and the work you're doing?
Thank you very much. So I'm not a Twitter person. I am on the Book of Faces here and there, but not for real. But if people want to send me a message with no expectations of an immediate response, I will take your message. Any work that I'm doing, because I'm a research associate with the Center for the Study of Higher Education, we have a communications team. So I'm working on pieces that will likely, how the publication process goes, probably won't likely be out until early next year. I do have a piece that's in IJQSC around race-conscious admissions, so people can find and read my work there. But yeah, people can send me emails if I know the answers. I'm not the guru to all things, but definitely if it's in my area of expertise and people have questions or even suggestions. People have heard me say several things today. if you're like, you know, Dr. Ward, I'd love to talk with you more about this, or I don't agree, what do you think about this? I welcome that.
Thank you. Well, this has been a pleasure for me. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to know more about the other events that the Dream Collective is hosting, we are now on social media. So you can check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Dream Collective 20. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.